Wait. Science, religion, and the movie Smallfoot, what do they have to do with each other? Hello and welcome to another ALC with Lance Phelps. Today I'm going to be looking at and analyzing the movie Smallfoot, and I'm going to be pulling out some of the themes that were found inside the movie and some of the more deep philosophical ideas that they tried to assert. And as a side note, before we get going, I wanted to note that media and music are like plays and music. In this case, the movie Smallfoot are a really good way to advance a worldview, sort of surreptitiously, where the writers of the movie or the writers of the play or the writers of the song will actually inculcate the ideas that are encapsulated in the movie through the very emotional form of the movie, because a good story draws the viewer in. But the good story has a lot of philosophical and theological freight, and that is what we're going to be getting into today. But before I continue, I'm going to just warn you right up front that if you haven't seen the movie Smallfoot, this contains spoilers. So stop right now if you haven't seen the movie Smallfoot and go watch the movie and then come back and then we'll continue our discussion. But you have been warned, there are spoilers ahead. So the movie Smallfoot, the other night I watched it with my family, and the whole time I was actually taking notes because of how deeply steeped in philosophical and theological ideas the movie actually was. On the surface, it does seem to be somewhat of a lighthearted children's movie, but I say on the surface, but it was really in your face, the level of brazenness that the writers embarked on this movie to sort of create the analogy of faith versus science. There's this idea that is just really palpable throughout the whole movie, that the scientific community was on one end and faith was on the other, and they were at odds with each other. Smallfoot can be summed up like this. Our hero, Migo, is a Yeti in a town that is up on top of a mountain. After we establish the way that the community operates, he discovers a Smallfoot, basically a human, and he goes back into the community to try to tell his community about his new discovery. But the Smallfoot idea is on one of the stones shown to be false because it is on the stone and written as false. So the community rejects him, and they ask him to recant, but he refuses to recant, and he is banished. He meets a small community after that helps him to open up, or helps him to explore the idea of Smallfoots. He finds a Smallfoot and brings it back to the community, and they still do not fully accept what he has to say. And then he has to go about convincing the community to believe that there are, in fact, small feet. The movie opens up with a musical number that basically sets the tone for the entire movie. The musical number, it has lines like this.
Seriously believe mammoths are holding us up?
What's holding up the mammoths?
Hello? It's just mammoths all the way down. Don't listen to them. They're questioning the stones, and we don't do that, okay?
If there's a question causing you to go astray, just stuff it down inside until it goes away. Got it?
The Yeti community is told that everything that is true is recorded on the stones, and if it's not recorded on the stones, then it cannot be possibly true, and the stones can never be questioned. They are setting forth a law that is absolute. Furthermore, the Yetis are told to suppress questions, to press questions down, and don't ask questions because questions are problematic. In fact, the movie has this particular line to say about that.
Look, I love my father, but he isn't exactly what you would call open to new ideas.
Because questions lead to knowledge.
And knowledge is power.
Now, I think that it's very clear that this movie was intended to be a critique of the religious community. It was intended to be a movie that sets forth an analogy of the Yeti community in its poor state, or in its state that's basically bound to these traditions that were established by previous Yeti leaders. It was intended to create this state of basically control. It's almost Karl Marx's religion as the opium of the peoples. But then throughout the movie, we see the opposing community being a small band of people, or Yetis, who believe that there is such a thing as a Smallfoot, because the main character character says that there is a such thing as Smallfoot, and it's not recorded in the stones, so the stones are right and the main character is wrong, even though he has plenty of evidence right in front of him. In this small community, and in the people that are supposed to represent the scientific community, you see a lot of chalkboard drawing and a lot of things that are supposed to be indicative of a scientific community. And furthermore, you see the idea that the scientific community is open to change. It's open to, examining the evidence and then reevaluating the way that it's supposed to believe. But the question is there really a conflict between science and religion? Alvin Plantinga, in his book Science and Religion, Where the Conflict Really Lies, Alvin Plantinga goes to great lengths to establish the truth of conflict in between science and religion. And he finds, most convincingly, that actually the conflict between science and religion is extremely rarely a conflict between the actual scientific method and a religious assertion. But nevertheless, the end case, or the end point that Alvin Plantinga wanted to make, and did make convincingly in his book, is that science and religion is not actually in conflict, not the scientific method at least, because the scientific method is nothing more than a method of exploring the natural world with various different modes of exploration. You propose a hypothesis based on empirical evidence, and then a hypothesis is then tested, and then you move from the testing from a hypothesis to a theory, and then once you go to a theory, you go into something that's more established, it's more scientific fact. The problem with our modern culture is that it has, in many cases, equated the true conflict between religion and the scientific community with the scientific method, and that is methodological naturalism. Now, methodological naturalism is the idea that there is only this material world, and there's a lot of different philosophical and theological concepts that flow from methodological naturalism. And this is where the vast majority of the conflict lies when it comes to the scientific community and religious community. The reason for this is that the modern day scientific community has become so enamored with methodological naturalism as a philosophical system to underpin the entire scientific pursuits that they're engaging in, that they have basically thrown religion out altogether. This, of course, is an interesting position to take, because methodological naturalism actually undermines the process of the scientific exploration. For instance, in his book Science and Its Limits by Del Rajk, I always have a hard time with that name, Ratsk. I think it's Rajk. I'll put it on the screen right here for all of you, those who are watching. Anyways, he lays out the fact that this methodological naturalism actually, it completely destroys the scientific method, because it undermines core philosophical assumptions that the scientific method utilizes. For instance, the progression of the world as being something that's constant. How can we justify our belief that the world is going to be the same tomorrow as it is today if we live in a world that is fundamentally chaos and not ordered by a personal being? And of course, the answer that Del Rajk comes up with is we cannot. And so science itself is resting atop a foundation. And when I say science, I mean science as the scientific method is resting, but that is resting atop a philosophical foundation and a theological foundation that allows the scientific community to move forward. And as we have seen in the last 200 years, this has been a slow and sometimes quick progression towards naturalism. Now, when we see these conflicts between science and religion, we are not actually seeing a conflict the vast majority of the times between science, the scientific method, and the religious communities. Now, of course, you do see it depending on which religious community, but of course, I'm referring primarily to Christianity versus science. In the scientific community, because of their methodological naturalism, there are many assertions that are made that have nothing to do with the scientific method, but are falsely equated to the scientific method. For instance, the existence of God. This is purely a theological and philosophical matter, something that we explore not with the scientific method, because the scientific method is not intended to tell us anything more than what's in the naturalistic world, but with other pieces of evidence, with our exploration of the world when it comes to philosophy and theology. And when we include a broader sweep or a broader scope of evidence and exploration, including theology and philosophy, we actually discover that the existence of God is is an absolute must for our universe. The question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Because in philosophy, we quickly discover that there cannot be something if there at one point was nothing. Therefore, there must have either always been something, there must have either been a world or a universe that existed for all of eternity, or there must have been a being that actually existed prior to the existence of the world. Because from nothing, nothing comes. This is a simple philosophical concept, one that naturalism basically just ignores for the most part. Another issue that generally comes up is the existence of miracles. Can there be a miracle that breaks the laws of nature? Philosophical naturalism says no, there cannot be any such idea. But the question is, why can there not be any such idea? There is no body of evidence that conclusively says, there's no scientific, hypothesis and theorem moving from empirical evidence that says there cannot be any miracles. This is instead a philosophical and theological idea that comes before the scientific method is even employed. And this is just assumed in the scientific community based on their methodological naturalism. But once you explore methodological naturalism in all of its intricacies, you discover how it actually is a baseless and foundationless idea, something that's mainly just convenient, instead of something that offers us a complete cosmology, a complete understanding of the universe. Now, when we analyze this movie and its analogy to see if this analogy actually holds true to real life, we actually find that though it's a scathing critique of the religious community, or of Christianity, I think in particular, because that's the most prominent religion in the United States, you find that it actually is more analogous to the stones, I should say, or the scathing critique can actually be better applied to the philosophical assumptions that science employs, that scientific community employs. The methodological naturalism is seen as something that cannot be compromised at all. And yet, there really is, it is a baseless foundation. It's a baseless reason for why. They just simply say it must be. They don't have any reason beyond that it must be. It's just a pre-assumed idea that they import into the scientific method. So one could say that the scientists or the scientific community in their methodological naturalism, when they're confronted with the difficulties of methodological naturalism, simply hold up a stone and say, it must be this way. Another aspect of all this is that the analogy seems to apply, or seems to imply inside the movie, that the Christian community has to suppress evidence, has to push things down. But the fact of the matter is that once you examine the actual core beliefs of Christianity, that's exactly not the case. In fact, throughout the Bible, we see many times where a skeptic comes forward, approaches the religious leaders and says, I don't know if I believe. But instead of them saying this, we see that in the Bible, Paul provides evidence for the risen Jesus. He actually tells of actual names. He says that Cephas and the apostles witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. So he also names, or he says that there are 500 other people, in essence telling people, go and ask them. He's providing proof for the resurrection of Jesus, a central claim of Christianity. So far from saying that we should suppress evidence, as this movie implies, the Christian community says that we should explore the evidence. We should explore and ask questions, and we will find that the Christian claims are true based on the evidence. So this movie goes to great lengths to establish this false dichotomy or false, problem or conflict between the religious community or Christianity and science. It's kind of a slap you in the face theme throughout the whole movie, but it's just simply a worn out trope that doesn't work. It's a trope that is baseless, foundationless, and it actually advances many inaccurate representations of the Christian community.